Under a moon swollen and silver, the ravine breathed like a wound carved into the earth. Runa Seland stood at its edge, bow drawn, breath held tight in her chest, as the gray wolf below circled something crumpled and still. Blood glistened black in the moonlight, pooling beneath a body too broad, too armored, to belong to any common man of these hills. The wolf's ears flattened. It sensed her before it saw her, the scent of a woman who did not belong to fear. Runa's arrow trembled against the string. One shot, one choice. Let the beast finish what the mountain had started, and walk home unseen, unburdened, unbroken by a stranger's fate, or step into the dark and become part of a story she could not yet imagine. Her fingers loosened. Not on the wolf, on her own resolve. She lowered the bow, unslung the hunting knife instead, and began her descent down the jagged rock, moonlight painting silver fire across her golden hair. The wolf snarled once, a warning, and vanished into the tree line as if it too understood. Some things are not meant to be devoured. Some things are meant to be found. She reached him as his eyes fluttered open, gray as storm clouds, sharp even in near death. And for one suspended heartbeat, the king of a kingdom she had never seen looked upon the Omega woman who would undo him entirely. "Who are you?" he rasped. Runa pressed her palm against his bleeding side, steady as a vow. Someone who couldn't walk away. He did not know her name yet. He did not know she would soon carry his enemy's blood in her memory, his people's fire in her dreams, or that fate, cruel, relentless, and utterly unbothered by mortal will, had only just begun its work. The cabin of Runa Seland smelled of dried herbs and hearth smoke, a modest refuge built where the forest met the silence of the valley. It was there that she brought him, dragging the weight of a man who seemed carved by the gods of winter themselves. And it was there that the story of two entwined fates truly began. For 2 days, Torben Grimstad drifted between the waking world and the shadowed realm of fever. Runa did not sleep in that time, not truly. She sat beside the straw pallet where she had laid him, pressing cool cloths to his brow, forcing bitter tinctures of yarrow and comfrey between his cracked lips, watching the rise and fall of his chest as though her own breath depended on it. She did not know his name. She did not know the crest half hidden beneath the torn leather of his tunic, nor the significance of the ring he wore, plain iron dulled by years of battle, yet etched with a wolf's head that no woman of her village would have recognized. She knew only that he was a stranger who bled, and that something ancient and stubborn in her heart refused to let strangers die alone. On the second night, his eyes opened. They were gray, not the gray of storm clouds as she had first thought in the ravine, but the gray of iron forged in fire, sharp, and assessing even through the haze of pain. He studied the low ceiling of the cabin, the flicker of firelight, the woman kneeling beside him with her golden hair loosed from its braid, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. "You are not dead," Runa said at last, setting down the cloth she had been wringing. "Though the gods alone know how. That wound in your side should have killed a lesser man 3 times over. I am not a lesser man." His voice was rough, unused, but there was a dry amusement buried beneath the pain, a man who jested even at the edge of the grave. "Where am I?" "Safe, for now." She reached for the bowl of broth she had kept warm by the fire, ignoring the way his gaze followed her every movement, wary as a cornered animal despite his weakened state. "You may thank the wolf that circled you for driving you into my path, and the moon for lighting the way. Had I not seen you, you would be bones by now." He said nothing to that, only watched her with an intensity that made her fingers tighten around the wooden spoon. There was something unsettling in the way he looked at her, not the gratitude of a rescued man, but the calculation of one accustomed to reading danger in every room he entered, every face that leaned near him. "What is your name?" he asked finally. She hesitated, some old instinct warning her that names held power. that a woman alone in the world did not simply give pieces of herself to strangers who woke with knives beneath their pillows. For she had found one, hidden in his boot, when she stripped away his ruined clothes to tend his wounds. But his eyes held hers, patient and unwavering, and something in her chest loosened despite her better judgment. "Runa," she said. "Runa Seland. Runa." He tested the name as though weighing gold on a scale, and something shifted behind his gaze. Not quite tenderness, not yet, but the first crack in a wall built over decades of solitude and command. A strong name, fitting, for a woman who drags grown men out of ravines alone. "You remember that?" "I remember little, cold, pain, silver hair against a silver moon." A ghost of a smile touched his mouth, quickly suppressed, as though he had forgotten how such an expression felt on his face. "I remember thinking I had died, and some merciful god had sent an angel to collect me." Runa felt heat rise to her cheeks and busied herself with the broth, spooning it toward his lips with more force than necessary. Angels do not smell of wet dog and bloodied leather. Drink. You will need your strength if you mean to keep flirting with a woman who has not yet decided whether you are worth the herbs I have wasted on you. He drank, though his eyes never left her face, and she felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing, foreign, unsettling, and yet not entirely unwelcome. There was a hunger in him that had nothing to do with the broth, a starvation of some deeper kind, as though he had spent so many years surrounded by subjects and soldiers and enemies that the simple act of being cared for had become a foreign language he was only now relearning. "Who are you?" she asked, when the bowl was empty, and the silence between them had grown heavy with unspoken things. "You carry yourself like no farmer or hunter I have known. That knife in your boot was not forged by common hands. And this—" She touched briefly the iron ring still circling his finger, feeling him tense beneath her fingers. "This is no ordinary man's trinket." For the first time since he had woken, something guarded flickered across his features. The shutting of a door, swift and absolute. A man who has seen too much war to trust easily. That is all you need know, for now. "For now," she echoed, arching a brow. "You speak as though there will be a later." "There is always a later, Runa Seland. Some debts are not paid in a single night." His voice had dropped low, rough with something that was not quite fever, and for a moment the firelight caught the sharp planes of his face, the days of dark stubble along his jaw, the sheer size of him even laid low upon her humble palate. A man built for war, for conquest, for the crushing of lesser wills, now utterly dependent on the mercy of a woman he had known less than 2 days. She should have been afraid. Some part of her, the sensible part, whispered that she ought to fear a man who spoke in riddles and carried hidden blades and wore rings etched with wolves. But there was another part of her, older, quieter, the part that had spent years alone in this cabin with only the wind and her own thoughts for company, that leaned toward him instead, drawn like iron to a lodestone. "Rest," she told him, more to steady her own racing pulse than out of any real concern for his healing. "Whatever debts you imagine you owe, they mean nothing if you tear your wound open arguing with me in the dark." He caught her wrist as she rose, not roughly, but with a strength that spoke of restraint rather than weakness, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "You saved my life. A king does not forget such things." The words slipped from him unguarded. A stone dropped into still water, and she watched the ripples of it cross his own face a heartbeat too late. The flicker of alarm, quickly masked at what he had revealed. "A king," she repeated slowly, her heart suddenly loud in her ears. "Whose king?" But he had already closed his eyes, feigning the exhaustion of a man too weary to answer, and no amount of gentle prodding could coax another word from his lips that night. Runa sat beside him long after his breathing had evened into true sleep, staring at the stranger in her home, at the ring on his finger and the scars upon his body that spoke of battles she could not imagine, and felt, for the first time in her solitary life, the cold and certain premonition that her world was about to change beyond recognition. She did not yet know his name. She did not yet know that the man sleeping beneath her roof commanded armies that could reduce her village to ash with a single word. She knew only that when she finally allowed her own eyes to close, exhaustion overtaking her at last in the chair beside his pallet, she dreamed not of danger, but of gray eyes and a voice that called her name like a vow. She did not know, as sleep claimed her fully, that dawn would find her alone. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from and how old you are, and subscribe to our channel to receive new stories every day that will touch your heart. I hope you enjoy the story. Runa woke to a cold that had nothing to do with the dying embers in her hearth. She knew it before her eyes fully opened, before her hand reached instinctively toward the pallet beside her chair. Some ancient sense, older than reason, that told her the room had changed shape in the night, that the weight which had filled her small cabin for 2 days had vanished like smoke through a chimney. The furs lay empty, still holding the impression of his body, still faintly warm at the edges as though he had only just risen. Torben? She had not even realized she knew to call him that until the word left her lips, a name she must have caught in his fevered murmurs sometime in the depths of the second night, tucked away without meaning to, the way one gathers fallen leaves without noticing the collecting until the basket is full. She said it again into the empty cabin, softer this time, as though a smaller voice might succeed where the first had failed. Nothing answered but the wind through the shutters. She rose too quickly, her joints stiff from a night spent folded into the wooden chair, and crossed the small room with a haste that embarrassed her even as she could not stop it. The door stood unlatched, swinging faintly on its leather hinges, and beyond it, the gray light of early dawn spilled across a threshold marked with nothing. No footprints in the soft earth, no broken branch, no sign at all that a man twice her size, wounded and weak only hours before, had passed this way in the dark. It was as though he had never existed, as though she had nursed a ghost, a fever dream conjured by too many lonely nights and too much moonlight pouring into a ravine. Then she saw it. A folded scrap of parchment, weighted down beneath the iron ring. His ring, the one etched with the wolf's head, the one he had guarded so carefully even in his weakest hour, set deliberately upon the small wooden table where she took her meals alone. Her hand trembled as she reached for it, some part of her already grieving before she understood what there was to grieve. The hand that had written it was strong, slashing, unaccustomed to gentleness. The hand of a man who commanded rather than pleaded, who was more familiar with issuing decrees than composing farewells. Yet the words themselves, when she finally forced her eyes to focus on them, carried a weight that betrayed something softer beneath all that iron. Runa Seland, I owe you a debt greater than these poor words can express. You found me broken in a place where I should have died, and you gave me back my life with hands that asked for nothing in return. I will not forget this. I cannot repay you as you deserve, not yet, not here. But know that a king does not forget the ones who save him, even when he must vanish like a coward in the night to protect them from what he carries. Keep the ring. It is worth more gold than this village has seen in a generation, though I suspect you would burn it for firewood before you sold it for coin. A foolishness I find myself strangely admiring. You will see me again. This I promise, though I cannot yet say when, or how, or whether you will curse my name when that day comes. Until then, live well, Runa Seland. The world is poorer for every day it does not know you. T.G. She read it 3 times before the words settled into something she could understand, and even then, understanding did little to ease the strange, hollow ache that had opened beneath her ribs. Anger came first, sharp and clean, easier to hold than the confusion beneath it. He had fled like a thief in the night, without so much as a farewell spoken aloud, without the courtesy of waking her to say the words himself. 2 days she had bled her own strength into keeping him alive, 2 days of sleepless vigil and bitter tinctures, and the particular exhaustion of caring for a body that was not her own. And this was his answer. A note. A ring she had not asked for. A promise that read more like a threat than a comfort. Live well, Runa Seland. As though he had any right to wish such things upon her, as though 2 days had earned him the intimacy of caring what became of her life after he vanished from it. She crumpled the parchment in her fist, then, ashamed of the sudden sting behind her eyes, smoothed it out again with fingers that shook more than she wanted to admit. The ring sat heavy in her palm when she finally lifted it, colder than she expected, the iron dulled by years of use, the wolf's head worn smooth in places where a thumb had clearly rubbed it countless times, an old habit of a nervous or thoughtful man. She turned it over, studying the craftsmanship, and could not deny what her own eyes told her, even as her mind rebelled against the conclusion. This was no farmer's trinket, no soldier's cheap keepsake. Whoever had forged this ring had done so with skill reserved for men of consequence. A king, he had said, before catching himself, before the walls slammed shut behind those storm-gray eyes. She should have pressed him then. She should have shaken him awake in the dead of night and demanded answers before sleep could steal her chance. Instead, she had let exhaustion claim her, let her guard soften toward a stranger whose name she had learned only by accident. And now she stood alone in her cabin at dawn, with nothing to show for 2 days of tender mercy, but a note full of half-truths and a ring she did not want. She told herself, as she dressed for the day and forced her hands into the familiar motions of building up the fire, of setting water to boil, of pretending the world had not tilted slightly on its axis sometime in the last 2 days. She told herself that this was, in truth, a mercy. Whatever storm had swept him into her ravine and out of it again was not a storm she needed in her life. She had built this solitary existence with careful, deliberate hands, brick by brick, after years of learning that an Omega who wished to survive on her own terms could not afford the luxury of needing anyone. She had grown strong precisely because she had stopped waiting for rescue, stopped hoping some fated bond would arrive to complete a life she had already learned to carry alone. And yet, the days that followed proved harder to fill than she expected. She returned to her usual rhythms, gathering herbs along the forest's edge, tending the small garden behind her cabin, trading dried remedies for grain and salted meat at the edges of the village market where she was known, if not warmly embraced, then at least tolerated for the usefulness of her skills. She kept to herself, as she always had, speaking only when spoken to, offering her cures with efficient hands and little conversation. This too was familiar. This too was the shape her life had worn for years, before a wounded stranger fell into her path beneath a swollen moon. But familiarity, she found, had grown strange in his absence. The cabin felt larger somehow, the silence heavier, as though the 2 days of his presence had stretched the walls outward, and now they could not quite shrink back to their former size. She caught herself, more than once, glancing toward the empty pallet where he had lain, half expecting to find him there still, propped against the furs with that dry, assessing gaze fixed upon her as though she were a puzzle he had not yet finished solving. She caught herself, too, turning the ring over in her fingers during quiet moments, while stirring broth, while walking the forest paths, while lying awake in her narrow bed unable to sleep for reasons she refused to name. She told herself she kept it only because it seemed wrong to discard something of such obvious value, that she meant to sell it eventually, perhaps when the winter grew lean and her stores grew thin. But some nights she found herself simply holding it, feeling the worn grooves of the wolf's head beneath her thumb, in the same absent way she imagined he must have done, a strange and silent communion across whatever distance now separated them. A king does not forget the ones who save him. What manner of king, she wondered, wandered wounded and alone through ravines far from any castle, with no guard, no retinue, no sign of the wealth and power his ring implied? What manner of king spoke with such rough, unpolished honesty, such dry humor even at the edge of death, such genuine, or expertly counterfeited tenderness toward a woman who owed him nothing and he, by every law of rank and station, owed nothing to in return. She did not know his kingdom. She did not know his people, his enemies, the shape of the world beyond her small corner of it. In her isolation, she had learned little of the politics that stirred beyond the forest's edge. Kings and their wars had always seemed a distant thing, stories told by travelers passing through, conflicts that unfolded in lands she would never see, and affected a life she had deliberately built to need nothing from the wider world. And yet now, for the first time in longer than she cared to admit, she found herself wondering about that wider world. Wondering what castle housed the man who had called her name like something precious in the dark hours before dawn stole him away. Wondering whether he thought of her at all, in whatever grand hall he now occupied, surrounded no doubt by silks and wine, and the deference owed to men of his station. Or whether she had already faded from his memory like morning mist beneath a rising sun, a curiosity indulged and then forgotten. You will see me again. This I promise. Weeks passed. The season shifted, the last warmth of autumn giving way to the crisp bite of encroaching winter. And still no sign came of the man who had promised so boldly that their story was not yet finished. Runa told herself she was relieved. She told herself, each night as she banked her fire and settled into the same solitary bed she had slept in for years before him, that this was proof enough of what she had always known. That promises made by powerful men to women who owed them nothing meant little once the danger had passed, and the debt, in his own mind, had been settled by a note and a ring left on a table. But some nights, when the wind howled through the trees in a voice that sounded almost like a wolf's low call, she found herself standing at her window, staring out toward the dark line of the ravine where it had all begun, and wondering, despite every hard-won lesson of her solitary life, whether promises made beneath a swollen moon carried a different kind of weight than promises made anywhere else. She did not yet know how right she was to wonder. She did not yet know that even now, in a kingdom she had never seen and could not have imagined, war councils gathered around long tables lit by torchlight, and that the world she had built so carefully around her own quiet solitude was about to be shattered beyond any recognition, not by fate's gentle hand, as she might have once hoped, but by the same iron will and unyielding purpose that had once made a wounded stranger, half dead in a ravine, refuse to let death claim him. She only knew that on a morning not unlike any other, she stepped out from her cabin to find the horizon strange, a smudge of smoke rising where no smoke should rise. And beyond the trees, faint but unmistakable, the sound of hoofbeats approaching from a direction no traveler had ever come from before. The great hall of Voldrick Keep burned with torchlight and impatience. A dozen war-hardened men gathered around a table scarred by decades of maps and blades and decisions that had cost thousands of lives. Torben Grimstad sat at its head, as he had sat 100 times before, and for the first time in his reign as king, he could not force his mind to remain in the room. The war had been decided long before the ravine, long before a woman with sun-colored hair had found him bleeding beneath a swollen moon. The kingdom of Eldervale had insulted his throne with a broken treaty, had raided the border villages under his protection, had spilled the blood of his people and laughed while doing it. The council had called for war within days of the offense, and Torben, proud, unyielding, a king who had never once shown mercy to those who threatened what was his, had agreed without hesitation. That had been before 2 days spent in a cabin smelling of dried herbs and hearth smoke. Before hands gentler than any he had known pressed cool cloths to his brow and forced bitter medicine between his lips with a stubbornness that matched his own. Before gray eyes met blue in firelight, and something ancient and unfamiliar had cracked open in his chest, like ice giving way to spring. The eastern approach through the valley offers the least resistance, Arnfinn Hegvik was saying, tracing a thick finger along the parchment map spread before them, its edges curling from years of use. Their walls are old, their garrison thin. We could take the capital within 3 days if we move at first light. And the outlying villages? This from Borglingard, broad-shouldered and grim, a man who had fought at Torben's side since they were boys, sparring with wooden swords in the training yards. Do we bypass them, or do we burn as we go? Burn, Dag Kvernus said flatly, without looking up from his own cup of mead. Leave nothing standing that might rally behind us. A clean campaign. Fast and absolute. Torben said nothing. His eyes were fixed on the map, on the small marked settlements scattered like scattered seeds across the eastern territories of Eldervale. And his mind, his treacherous, unguarded mind, was not counting soldiers or calculating supply lines. It was counting days. 2 days in a cabin, weeks since he had fled it like a coward in the dark, leaving nothing behind but a ring and a note too proud to say what he truly felt. Runa. He did not know, precisely, which village sheltered her modest cabin at the forest's edge. He had been too fevered upon arrival to mark his path with any certainty, too focused on survival to note the roads he traveled once his strength returned enough to walk. But he knew, with the same bone-deep certainty that had guided him through a dozen battles, the instinct that had never once failed him, that she dwelt somewhere within the very borders his men now planned to reduce to ash and ruin. The thought of it closed around his throat like a fist. My king! Jarl Sannes's voice cut through the fog of his thoughts, sharp with the particular impatience of a man who had asked a question twice already. You have not spoken on the matter of the villages. Do we burn, as Dag suggests, or do we show restraint? Every eye in the hall turned toward him, waiting, and Torben understood in that moment the particular danger of his position. He was a king who had built his reputation on ruthless efficiency, on decisions made swiftly and without sentiment, on a heart that his enemies believed, rightly until recently, to be as cold and unyielding as the iron he wore. If he showed hesitation now, if his men glimpsed even a shadow of the storm raging beneath his composed exterior, they would ask why. They would wonder. And a king's weakness, once glimpsed by those closest to him, became a wound that never fully healed. He could not tell them the truth. He could not say that somewhere within those villages marked for burning lived the only person who had ever looked at him and seen a man rather than a crown, who had tended his wounds with her own hands and asked for nothing in return, who haunted his waking thoughts and his restless dreams in equal, maddening measure. He could not say that the thought of flame touching her home, of his own soldiers, his own command, bringing harm to the woman who had saved his life, felt like a blade turned inward, twisting with every beat of his traitorous heart. A king did not fall in love with a stranger in the space of 2 fevered days. A king did not lie awake in his own castle, in his own bed of furs and silk far finer than anything her humble cabin had offered, aching for the particular warmth of her hands and the particular music of her voice scolding him for arguing while wounded. And yet here he sat, proof of exactly that impossibility, forced now to weigh the lives of an entire kingdom's worth of villages against the singular, selfish desperation to protect one woman he had known for 2 days and could not stop thinking of for the week since. He thought quickly, the same swift, calculating mind that had won him 100 battles now turning itself toward a different kind of war, one fought not with swords, but with words carefully chosen to disguise the truth beneath them. Burning wastes resources, he said finally, his voice carrying the same flat authority it always did, betraying nothing of the storm beneath it. Ash cannot be taxed, rubble cannot be worked, cannot be farmed, cannot fill our coffers or feed our own people through the winter that follows. We are not raiders, striking and vanishing into the night. We mean to hold Eldervale, to fold its lands into our own. What use is a conquered kingdom reduced to cinders? Dag frowned, unconvinced. Restraint breeds rebellion, my king. Leave their villages standing, leave their people whole, and you leave them the strength to rise against us within a season. Then we do not leave them whole. Torben leaned forward, his elbows braced against the scarred wood of the table, and forced his expression into something he hoped resembled cold calculation rather than desperate improvisation. We take what strengthens us and strips them of the will to resist. The women of fighting age and skilled trade, healers, weavers, those with hands worth more alive than dead, we take as spoils of war, servants for our own halls, labor for our own fields. It weakens their capacity to rebuild while it enriches our own kingdom. The old, the very young, the men who yield without resistance, them we leave, disarmed and broken but breathing, a conquered people too devastated to fight, yet too intact to burn our future resources on garrisoning against ghosts. Silence fell across the war table as his commanders considered this, and Torben forced himself to breathe evenly, to betray nothing of the wild hope beating against his ribs. A healer. If she still lived in that cabin at the forest's edge, if his men found her among the frightened villagers rounded up in the chaos of conquest, the word alone might be enough. A woman skilled in tinctures and wound binding, valuable, worth the taking rather than the burning. It was not mercy, not on its surface. It was strategy, cold and pragmatic, the very language his men understood and respected. It was also, beneath every careful word, the only shield he could raise between Runa Seland and the war he had set in motion before he ever knew her name. A pragmatic approach, Arnfinn said slowly, nodding as the logic settled over him. Spoils of war have always strengthened conquering kingdoms. My own grandmother came to this hall the same way, 3 generations past, and served the crown with more loyalty than half the soldiers in this room. Then it is decided. Borg struck the table once, decisive. We march at first light. Take the villages with minimal resistance, spare the labor worth sparing, and press toward the capital before their king can rally a proper defense. Torben nodded, his outward composure a mask stretched thin over the churning storm beneath, and gave the order that would carry his armies across the border by morning. The march took 4 days. Torben rode at the head of his forces as he always did, his face carved from the same cold granite his enemies had come to fear across a decade of campaigns. He gave orders with the same crisp efficiency he always had, watched villages fall with the same detached calculation, and if his heart hammered harder than any battle had ever demanded each time his men reported a new settlement secured, he allowed no flicker of it to reach his features. He did not know her village by name. He had described only vague, half-remembered landmarks to his scouts. A forest's edge, a modest cabin set apart from the others, a ravine not far beyond where a man might have fallen and nearly died beneath a swollen moon. And prayed, in the silent way of men unaccustomed to prayer, that fate would not be so cruel as to have led him this far, only to lose her in the chaos of his own making. It was on the 3rd day, as the sun began its slow descent behind smoke-hazed hills, that a young soldier came riding hard toward the column, breathless with news that made Torben's carefully guarded heart seize in his chest. "My king, we have taken a village at the forest's western edge. Among the captives, a woman matching the description you gave. Golden hair, a healer by trade, found alone in a cabin apart from the others." Torben did not remember dismounting. He did not remember the ground beneath his boots as he strode past his own soldiers, past the frightened, huddled prisoners bound for the long march to his kingdom, his eyes scanning face after face with a desperation he could not fully disguise even now. And then he saw her, bound at the wrists, her golden hair loosed from its braid and tangled with the dust of her fallen village, her chin lifted with a defiance that struck him harder than any blade ever had, even as tears she refused to let fall glistened in eyes that had once looked upon him with nothing but gentle care. Her gaze found his across the chaos of the encampment, and he watched recognition dawn. Swift, brutal, absolute. Watched the exact moment she understood that the stranger she had saved, the man who had vanished with only a note and a promise, was the very king who had reduced her world to ruin. Something in her face broke that he knew, with a certainty colder than any battlefield, he would spend the rest of his life trying to mend. He crossed the distance between them before he could think better of it, ignoring the curious glances of his own men, and drew her aside into the shadow of a half-burned granary wall, away from listening ears, away from eyes that might read too much truth in a king's desperate gentleness. Runa. Her name came out rougher than he intended, thick with things he could not yet say aloud. "Runa, look at me." She would not. Her jaw remained set, her eyes fixed on some point past his shoulder, and the silence between them carried more accusation than any scream could have managed. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper, meant for her alone in the smoke-heavy dusk. "I know what you must think of me now. I know there are no words I can offer that will undo what has been done here today. But hear me. You are not going to be harmed. Not by my men, not by anyone within my walls. I swear this to you on the same breath that once swore you would see me again." Still she said nothing, though he saw the faint tremor in her bound hands, the effort it cost her to hold herself so rigidly composed. "I did not know," he continued softer still, "that this village was yours, until my men had already taken it. But I promise you, Runa Seland, whatever comes next, whatever you must endure within my walls, I will not let harm find you. Not while breath remains in my body. Everything will be all right. I swear it. I will make this right, however long it takes." Her eyes finally lifted to his then, glassy with unshed tears and blazing with a fury that pierced him deeper than any enemy's blade ever had, and though she said not a single word in answer, Torben understood, with the particular clarity of a man who has finally, catastrophically fallen in love, that he had just made a vow he intended to spend the rest of his life keeping, no matter how long it took her to believe it. The castle of Voldrick Keep rose from the northern cliffs, like something carved by giants rather than men, its stone halls cold even in the height of summer, its shadows long and watchful. It was here that Runa Seland learned the particular cruelty of captivity. Not chains, not whips, not the brutality she had braced herself for in the long, humiliating march from her ruined village, but something subtler and infinitely more disorienting. The sight of the man who had destroyed her home sitting upon a throne of dark wood and iron, utterly transformed into a stranger she did not recognize. By day, King Torben Grimstad was exactly what she had feared him to be. Cold, commanding. A voice that filled the great hall without rising above a measured, authoritative calm. Eyes that swept over servants and prisoners alike, with the same detached assessment one might give to livestock or grain stores. When she was brought before him on her first morning within the castle walls, forced to kneel among a dozen other captured villagers while his steward read out their assignments, he had not looked at her once. Not truly, not in any way that betrayed the 2 days she had spent nursing him back from death's threshold. "This one," the steward had announced, gesturing toward her with the same indifference he might use for cattle. "Trained in healing arts. Assign her to the garden stores, tending the medicinal beds." Torben's gaze had passed over her then, brief and unremarkable, and he had given only a small nod before turning his attention to the next captive in line. No recognition. No softness. Nothing at all to suggest that this was the same man who had once caught her wrist in the fire-lit dark of her cabin and called her name like something precious. Runa told herself she was relieved by his indifference. She told herself as she was led away to the small stone chamber that would become her quarters. Modest, but cleaner and warmer than she had expected for a prisoner of war. That this was proof of what she had always suspected. That whatever tenderness had passed between them in those fevered days was nothing more than the desperate gratitude of a dying man, forgotten the moment his strength returned and his crown reclaimed him. She was wrong. It was well past the midnight bell on her third night in the castle when she heard the soft, deliberate knock upon her door, not the heavy fist of a guard, but something more careful, almost hesitant. She rose from her narrow bed, wary, one hand closing around the small paring knife she had managed to smuggle from the kitchens that afternoon, and opened the door only enough to see who dared disturb her in the depths of night. Torben stood in the corridor, alone, a hooded cloak drawn over his broad shoulders, as though he meant to disguise himself from his own household. In his arms he carried a woven basket, and behind the guarded stillness of his expression, she caught, just barely, just for a heartbeat, the same uncertain vulnerability she remembered from the cabin. Buried now beneath layers of kingship, he seemed desperate to shed the moment the door was between them and the rest of the world. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, though she made no move to close the door fully against him. 10 minutes, he said, low and urgent. "Give me 10 minutes, and then I will leave, and you may hate me again in peace for as long as you wish." She should have refused. Every instinct honed by weeks of grief and fury told her to slam the door and bar it, to deny him even this small victory. But something in the rawness of his voice, the way his hands trembled faintly around the basket he held, stayed her hand, and she stepped back just enough to let him pass. He set the basket upon her small table, and began, without preamble, to unpack it. Dried lavender and chamomile, rare herbs she recognized from healers' texts, but had never possessed the coin to purchase. A warm woolen blanket dyed a deep, rich blue, a small jar of honey, and beneath it all, wrapped carefully in cloth, a proper healer's satchel. Tools far finer than any she had owned in her modest cabin. "I am not asking for forgiveness," he said quietly, before she could speak. "I know I have no right to it, and I would not insult you by pretending otherwise. But I could not sleep, knowing you slept cold in a room I commanded be given to you, wearing clothes rougher than you deserve, tending gardens with tools that dull faster than they should." He gestured toward the basket, almost helpless in his explanation. "This is not payment for what I took from you. There is no payment for that. This is only—" He stopped, searching for words that seemed to elude even a man accustomed to commanding armies with his voice alone. "This is only a small mercy, offered by someone who cannot undo the cruelty, but cannot bear to add to it either." Runa stared at the offerings on her table, feeling the same treacherous ache from weeks ago rise unbidden in her chest. The same confusion that had plagued her since the moment she read his farewell note, torn between the fury that was hers by right and the memory of a man who had looked at her once, as though she were the only steady thing in a world built on iron and command. "You destroyed my home," she said, and her voice cracked despite her effort to keep it steady. "You burned fields I helped tend since I was a girl. You dragged me from the only life I had built for myself, alone by my own hands. And you think herbs and blankets undo that?" "No." His answer came immediate and unflinching, and there was something almost like relief in his tone, as though her anger were easier to bear than her silence. "Nothing undoes that. I do not ask you to forget it, Runa. I do not even ask you to forgive it. Not yet. Not soon. Perhaps. Not ever. I ask only that you let me try to be less than the monster you have every right to believe me." "And if someone finds you here?" She crossed her arms, though the gesture felt more like armor than true composure. "A king, sneaking through his own halls in the dead of night to visit a servant girl he claims not to know by daylight. What would your counsel say to that?" Something flickered across his face. Not quite shame, but close to it. "My counsel would say I have lost my senses. My rivals within these walls would call it weakness, would seize upon it as proof that the Iron King has grown soft, vulnerable to be exploited. I cannot afford that, Runa. Not now. Not while old enemies still watch for any crack in my rule to widen into ruin." He met her eyes then, steady despite the confession. "So I ask this of you, though I have no right to ask anything. Let what happens between us in these quiet hours remain between us alone. Not because I am ashamed of you. Never that. But because the moment my enemies believe I hold something precious enough to protect, they will move heaven and earth to take it from me. and I could not survive watching harm come to you a second time because of decisions I made to keep my throne." Runa said nothing for a long moment, turning his words over with the same wary suspicion she had once reserved for wild animals circling too close to her cabin. Everything in her wanted to reject his logic, to name it for what it so easily could be. A coward's excuse, a king unwilling to risk his own reputation, even as he sought absolution from the woman he had wronged. And yet, she thought of the note left on her table weeks ago, the careful, guarded words of a man unaccustomed to vulnerability. She thought of his hand closing around her wrist in the firelight, the word king slipping unguarded from his lips before he could catch it. She thought, too, of the way his soldiers had looked at her during the long march, confused by orders that spared her from the harshest labor, that kept her separate from the worst of the captive's treatment. Orders given so subtly that even she had not understood their true purpose until this very moment. "You gave orders," she said slowly, understanding dawning even as she spoke it aloud. "Along the march, to keep me apart from the others, to ease what should have been unbearable. That was you." He did not deny it. "I could not protect you from the war itself. That damage was done before I ever knew your name, set in motion by treaties broken and blood spilled long before a wounded stranger fell into your path beneath the moon. But everything after, every small mercy I could offer, without revealing what you mean to me. I have tried, Runa. Clumsily, perhaps. Insufficiently. Certainly. But I have tried." The silence that followed stretched long between them, filled with things neither seemed willing yet to name. Runa looked at the basket on her table, at the fine healer's tools he had brought her, at the warm blanket that would spare her the worst of the coming winter nights, and felt the fragile, furious walls she had built since the day of her capture crack. Not shatter, not yet, but crack, just enough to let a sliver of something dangerously close to hope slip through. "I do not forgive you," she said finally, though the words carried less conviction than they had an hour before. "I may never forgive you, Torben Grimstad. What you took from me cannot be measured in herbs and blankets, however fine." "I know." His voice was quiet, accepting, though something in his eyes betrayed how much the words cost him to hear. "I do not ask for forgiveness tonight. I ask only that you let me keep trying to earn it, in whatever small, secret ways I can manage, for as long as it takes." She did not answer him directly, but when he turned to leave, drawing his hood back up over his dark hair, melting once more into the role of the cold and distant king. He must play by daylight, she found herself speaking before she could stop the words. "Same time. Tomorrow." A pause, her chin lifting with the same defiance that had first caught his attention in the chaos of her captured village. "Bring more honey. The kitchens here are stingy with their portions." The ghost of a smile, real, unguarded, the first she had seen since the ravine, touched his mouth before he could suppress it, and he inclined his head in something almost like a bow before slipping back into the shadowed corridor, leaving Runa alone with a basket of small mercies and a heart that refused, despite every reasonable argument against it, to fully close itself against the man who had broken it in the first place. The weeks that followed Torben's midnight visits wove themselves into something Runa had not expected to find within the walls of her captor's castle, a fragile, secret rhythm of stolen hours and small kindnesses, of guarded glances across crowded halls that meant nothing to anyone watching and everything to the two people exchanging them. She had not forgiven him. She told herself this each night, even as she found herself waiting for his soft knock upon her door, even as the healer's satchel he had given her grew worn from daily use, even as the warmth of him lingered in her thoughts long after he slipped back into the shadows before dawn. But secrets, however carefully guarded, have a way of straining against the walls built to contain them. It happened on a morning when frost had begun creeping across the castle gardens, silver and sharp against the last dying green of autumn. Runa knelt among the medicinal beds, her hands buried in cold earth, when the sound of raised voices carried from the great hall's open doors. Sharp, furious, carrying the particular venom of men who had waited long for an opportunity to strike. "Word has reached us, my king, of a certain fondness you have shown toward one of the captured healers." The voice belonged to a lord Runa did not recognize, thin and reedy, dripping with barely concealed triumph. Nightly visits, gifts smuggled through back corridors, orders given in secret to spare her the treatment owed to a prisoner of war. Tell me, Torben Grimstad, does the Iron King now bend his knee to a peasant girl from the very kingdom he conquered? Runa's hands stilled in the frozen soil. She rose slowly, drawn despite every instinct toward self-preservation, and made her way to the edge of the garden where she could see through the tall doors into the hall beyond. Torben, upon his throne, his spine rigid, his face carved from the same cold granite she remembered from her first humiliating morning within these walls. Around him stood perhaps a dozen lords and councilmen, and at their head, a man with sharp, calculating eyes that reminded her uncomfortably of a fox circling a wounded hare. "You overstep, Lord Kettering." Torben's voice carried the flat, dangerous calm of a king unaccustomed to challenge. "Whatever kindness I extend to those within my walls is mine to give as I see fit." Kindness. Kettering's laugh held no warmth. "Is that what we call it now, when a king sneaks through his own corridors after midnight like a common thief courting a scullery maid? Your father built this kingdom on strength, my king, on the certainty that no weakness, no softness, could ever be used as a blade against our throne. And now you would risk everything, your reputation, your authority, the fear that has kept our borders safe for a decade, for a peasant woman who by rights should still be scrubbing floors in your kitchens." Runa felt something cold and sick settle in her stomach, watching the color drain from beneath Torben's controlled expression, watching him weigh, as he must, as any king would be forced to weigh, the cost of the truth against the cost of continued denial. She braced herself, in that moment, for him to deny it, to laugh off the accusation, to protect his throne as any sensible ruler would, to prove once and for all that whatever tenderness had passed between them in stolen midnight hours meant nothing beside the weight of his crown. He rose instead. Slowly, deliberately, Torben Grimstad stood from his throne, and something in the set of his shoulders made the entire hall fall silent before he even spoke a word. "You are right to call it weakness, Lord Kettering." His voice carried clear and unflinching across the stunned assembly. "For that is precisely what it is. I am weak for her. I have been weak for her since the moment she found me bleeding in a ravine, and chose mercy over indifference, though I was a stranger who owed her nothing, and she owed me even less. I was weak enough to flee her cabin like a coward, rather than face what she made me feel. I was weak enough to wage a war I could not stop, knowing it would tear her from the life she built with her own 2 hands, and I have spent every day since trying to atone for a cruelty I will carry until my last breath." Gasps rippled through the assembled lords, but Torben did not falter, his eyes finding Runa now where she stood frozen at the garden's threshold, framed in morning light, and something in his gaze, open, unguarded, utterly stripped of the careful mask he had worn for weeks, made her breath catch in her throat. "If loving her makes me weak," he continued, quieter now but no less certain, "then let every man in this hall know I have never been prouder to bear that weakness. I would rather rule as a man who loves fiercely than a king who fears nothing, for a heart that cannot be moved is no heart worth having at all. Runa Seland saved my life without knowing my name or my crown. She asked for nothing in return, and I intend to spend whatever years remain to me proving myself worthy of that mercy, publicly, without shame, without hiding behind midnight shadows any longer." Lord Kettering's face had gone pale with fury, his mouth opening to argue, but Torben's gaze swept the hall with the same commanding authority that had won him 100 battles, silencing further protest before it could form. "Any man who believes this makes me unfit to rule is welcome to challenge that claim openly, rather than skulking through corridors gathering gossip like a common spy. Until then, I suggest this council concern itself with matters of actual consequence." The hall remained silent, and Torben, without waiting for further argument, descended the steps of his throne and crossed the length of the great hall. Past his stunned councilmen, past Kettering's impotent fury, out through the tall doors and into the frost-bitten garden where Runa stood, still frozen, still hardly able to comprehend what she had just witnessed. "You did not have to do that," she whispered when he stopped before her, close enough that she could see the vulnerability still trembling beneath his composed exterior. "I did," he said simply. "I have spent weeks proving myself to you in secret, telling myself I protected you by hiding what you mean to me. But secrets are not protection, Runa. Secrets are cowardice dressed in careful language. You deserve a man who is not ashamed to be seen loving you, whatever it costs him." She did not answer him with words. She could not. Not yet. Not with her heart still racing from the shock of watching him lay his crown's authority bare before men who would use any weakness against him. But something in her chest, something that had been slowly, painfully thawing since the night of the herbs and the woolen blanket, cracked further still, and she found herself reaching for his hand before she fully understood the impulse. Her fingers curling around his with a tentative trust she had not offered anyone in longer than she cared to remember. He took her home 3 days later. The journey to her ruined village passed in comparative silence. Torben riding beside her rather than ahead, as a king might be expected to, close enough that their horses' shoulders nearly touched along the frost-hardened road. Runa had braced herself for the sight of ash and ruin, for the particular grief of witnessing everything familiar reduced to rubble by the very man now riding beside her with such careful, hopeful patience. What she found instead stole the breath from her lungs entirely. Where her village had burned, new timber rose in careful, deliberate construction, half-finished homes standing where ash had once smoldered, the skeleton of a rebuilt hall taking shape at the village center. Familiar faces she recognized from her old life moving among the construction, with tools bearing the unmistakable craftsmanship of Torben's own kingdom. Near the village's edge, where her own modest cabin had stood, she saw new foundations laid, fresh timber stacked and waiting, the unmistakable beginnings of a home larger and sturdier than the one she had lost. "I began this the week after you were brought to my castle," Torben said quietly, watching her reaction with the same guarded hope she remembered from their very first conversation, weeks and a lifetime ago, in the flickering firelight of her old cabin. "I could not undo the burning. I could not return the days of labor your people spent building lives I destroyed in a single afternoon of war. But I could rebuild what fire took. And I have spent every resource my kingdom could spare doing exactly that, in the hope, however undeserved, that it might prove my regret carries more weight than words alone." Runa dismounted slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her, and walked among the rising timber frames with a hand pressed to her chest, as though she might otherwise fall apart entirely. Villagers she recognized, faces marked by loss but softened now by cautious hope, nodded to her as she passed, some even offering small, uncertain smiles. The particular gratitude of people who understood, perhaps better than she had allowed herself to, that redemption could take root even in ground scorched by war. She found herself, at last, standing before the foundation of her own rebuilt home, Torben close behind her, his silence heavy with unspoken hope. "Why?" she asked, turning to face him fully, her voice thick with the particular ache of a heart finally allowing itself to break open. "Why go to such lengths? You are a king. You could have simply moved forward, let the past remain buried beneath ash, and no one would have questioned it. Because I love you." The words came simply, without hesitation, stripped of every careful calculation that had once guarded his heart from a world that demanded strength above all else. "I have loved you since a woman with sun-colored hair pulled a dying stranger from a ravine and asked for nothing in return. I loved you in the fever of those 2 days, though I was too frightened of what it meant to say so before I fled into the dark. I loved you through every mile of a war I could not stop. Every night I spent aching for forgiveness I did not deserve. Every secret visit that was never enough to satisfy the truth, I finally spoke aloud before my own council. He stepped closer, his hand rising to brush a strand of golden hair from her face, with a tenderness that belied every fearsome legend whispered about the Iron King in kingdoms far beyond his own. I do not ask you to forget what I took from you, Runa Seland. I ask only that you let me spend the rest of my life giving back everything I can, for as long as you will allow it. Runa looked up at him. This man of such fierce, terrible duality, feared across a dozen kingdoms, and yet trembling now before her with a vulnerability few living souls had ever witnessed, and felt the last of her carefully guarded walls finally give way entirely, not with the violence of destruction, but with the quiet, inevitable grace of ice yielding at last to spring. "I forgive you," she whispered, and the words, once spoken, seemed to lift some ancient weight from both their shoulders at once. "Not because you rebuilt these walls, though I will treasure the labor of every hand that raised them. Not because you knelt before your own council and named your weakness aloud, though I do not think I will ever forget the courage it cost you. I forgive you because I have watched you become, slowly and painfully, a better man than the one who fled my cabin in the dark. And because some foolish, stubborn part of my heart has loved you since the very first moment your eyes opened in my firelight, storm gray and utterly unguarded." Torben's breath caught, something raw and disbelieving crossing his features before joy broke through entirely, transforming the fearsome king into simply a man, humbled, grateful, and utterly hers. "Runa Seland," he murmured, his hands rising to cradle her face with a reverence that spoke louder than any crown or conquest ever could. "You have undone me entirely." "Good," she breathed, rising onto her toes to close the last distance between them. "See that you remember it." And there, amid the rising timber of a village reborn from ash, beneath a pale winter sun that promised warmer days ahead, the Alpha King of Voldric keep-kissed Runa Seland, not as a conqueror claiming spoils of war, but as a man who had traveled through fire and pride and fear to finally, fully surrender his heart to the only woman who had ever dared to save it. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this beautiful love story. Let us know what you thought of this tale full of emotions and surprises. Tell us your name, where you're watching from, and rate this story from 0 to 10 if it touched your heart. And if you enjoyed the plot, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the amazing new stories coming soon. See you next time.